Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Christians in Science online event. My name is Gavin Merrifield, and I am the General Secretary of Christians in Science, and I'll be hosting us for the next hour or so. It's good to see so many of you have joined us for what promises to be a fascinating and insightful dive into the combined worlds of artificial intelligence and religion. So we hear a lot about both of these in the news and media, and in many ways they are at the forefront of public concern and opportunity as well, as being of great academic interest in their own right. Our speaker tonight will be helping us to unpack the meaning of both artificial intelligence, which we often call just AI, and religion a bit more, and help us to explore how these two might be influencing one another. This event has been organised by Christians in Science. We are an organisation that seeks to encourage and build better relations between the church and the modern scientific enterprise. We also provide opportunities for fellowship and support for Christians who work in the sciences. As part of this, our events run from a Christian perspective, but anyone from any background with an interest in how science, religion, and faith might positively enrich each other is very welcome. You can go to our website at www.cis.org.uk to find out more about us or to access other resources. Recordings from many of our past events and conferences can also be found on our YouTube page. If you would like to support our work in a practical way, then can I ask you to consider whether you might like to become a member or a friend of CIS, or just by making a donation to our ongoing work. Details for all of these options can also be found on our website. So we have a number of conferences and other online events being planned across the rest of the year. So to stay up to date with those, keep an eye on our website or our social media posts on various platforms. But two immediate dates for your diaries to consider are Saturday, June the 15th, when we'll be hosting our Connect conference at Holy Trinity Church in Aylesbury. And this is a day event primarily aimed at those who are students, postgrads, or early career researchers, but anyone is welcome to come. And our main conference for the year will be on Friday the 25th and Saturday the 26th of October down in Birmingham, and this will be our 80th anniversary celebration and conference. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for this, and we are looking forward to not just looking back over our long history, but also forward to the new opportunities and possibilities around science and Christian belief. Now, if you can't make either of those in person, they'll also be broadcast online, and we'd be delighted to have you join us there as well. The details of these events will be on our website as they are finalised over the next few weeks. And you can also find details of CIS local groups who host their own events in different parts of the UK as well on our website. So moving on to tonight's event, I was just mentioning that we are celebrating our 80th anniversary as an organisation this year, and I've been reading around the history of ourselves and the kind of surrounding cultural environment from which we first emerged. And one of the things I've most been struck by and delighted about is how the whole discussion around science and religion, and especially for us in CIS, science and Christianity, has kind of just matured over those 80 years. When we began as the Research Scientists Christian Fellowship, there was a lot of difficulty for many, both inside and outside the church, about how to bring science and religious belief together. There was a lot of open hostility from both sides. And the conflict thesis, the idea that science and religion must be at loggerheads, was in full swing in academia, our churches, and amongst the public. Now, CIS was born into this mix with the objective to provide a more useful and helpful alternative. And while in parts of wider society, we are still struggling to shake off that legacy of conflict, great strides have since been made. And I like to think that within the church, at least, CIS has had a part to play in that. No, it isn't that we just play more nicely with each other now, but we do. But also those strides have been in the depth and nuance of our understanding. And in the academic sphere, at least, science and religion has largely moved on from that false conflict model to one where the story is more a great web of interactive elements that spans many centuries and many subjects. Indeed, science and religion is now something worthy of study in itself, and is no longer the preserve solely of the religious, but of interest to people of all personal religious faiths or none. For those of us who are Christians, to have an outsider's view on ourselves and for our own thinking and actions to be studied, I think in a fair manner, I think is one of the exciting things going on in the field today. and shows just how far we have come in the last 80 years. So seeking that outside input and conversation is healthy for us, and I think it is also healthy for the church. And it's not something that we in CIS have really chosen to do much of until now. So tonight's talk is from that outside perspective, and it will only be the first of such talks going forwards, with the aim and the hope that we will be able to foster more two-way conversations and friendships with those outside of our own immediate Christian sphere. Now, to get a bird's eye view of studying science and religion, and then to observe how that momentum of thought interacts with new technological issues of the day, such as AI, I think it takes someone very dedicated, very observant, and I would also say brave. And that is who we have in Professor Beth Sinclair, our speaker tonight. Beth is Assistant Professor of Digital Religion or Religions at the University of Zurich, where she is an expert on how societies interact with the fast-moving field of artificial intelligence, especially with regard to religious groups. She also thinks about the parallels between thought around AI and religion, as we will see tonight. Beth has been studying and publishing in these areas for many years now, across a broad range of journals and in numerous books, drafts of which have recently been submitted for another batch of them. So she has also spoken at many conferences, events, and podcasts, and she's very active on social media, casting a necessary raised eyebrow or small chuckle at much of the AI news of the day. I've probably learned more about the impact of AI by following Beth on Twitter than I have by any of the books in the field that I've read. So before I hand over to Beth, just to say that our format for tonight will be a presentation from Beth, followed by our usual time of questions and discussions. You can put your questions in the chat window here in Zoom, either at the end of Beth's talk or as they occur to you throughout. We'll do our best to discuss as many of these things and wrap up around 8 p.m, unless, of course, the questions keep coming and keep us in full swing. And if that happens, please don't feel obliged to stay beyond 8 p.m. if you need to head off, but we might continue for a few minutes after as Beth's time allows. So now I would like to hand over to Beth for her talk titled AI and the Future of Religion. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you for that very warm introduction, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening. Let me just check technology works so I can share my slides. It doesn't always work first time. Someone shout if it's not visible. I think it seems to be. There we go. Okay, so as Gavin explained in his introduction, I come slightly as an outsider, as a cultural and digital anthropologist of religion and religion and technology in particular, with a specific view on artificial intelligence. I try to engage with the conversations around AI and the locations in which AI and robotics as an embodied form of artificial intelligence are present, the places where people are discussing and describing this new technology, and in particular, as someone who comes from an anthropology of religion background, where those ideas overlap with religious conceptions, where people from established and mainstream religious faiths might also want to employ this technology in various different ways. So this slide just illustrates some of the areas of interest that I've had, some of the spaces in which I've been, museums that have had exhibitions on robots where I've been able to observe people observing robots. I'm a digital ethnographer, so I'm looking at social media and the conversations that are happening there. As Gavin also mentioned, I'm frequently on Twitter, not only doing research, but also being probably a bit of a pain in the butt for some people. But I find that an interesting space for the ongoing conversation about artificial intelligence and where it's going. And you might recognize some science fiction there as well. I'm a huge geek. I love Star Wars, Star Trek, all the places in which AI and robots are dreamt about and what they might be in the future. But for today's talk, I will talk specifically around the ideas about where AI is going in terms of the religious sphere. I want to start with a more general introduction to what AI is, because as an anthropologist, I'm not necessarily tackling that subject just in terms of the specifics of the technology. I'm also interested in people's discourse and discussion around artificial intelligence. And I'll touch briefly on generative AI because it's quite sort of seminal at the moment. It's an area of the technology that's getting the most discussion. It's the area where most people can actually most directly engage with artificial intelligence. And then I want to sort of expand on that to some of the current concerns and religious thoughts about artificial intelligence. I want to introduce some of the views of AI as going in a particular direction. The title of this talk is about the future, and a lot of people have some very distinct ideas about what the AI future is going to be. And related to that, what the future of religion is going to be in a world that is infused with artificial intelligence as a technology in particular forms, and helping us in particular ways. So I want to talk about some of the discussion around the idea of AI creating religion. So either in terms of how simulations, various forms of artificial intelligence might encourage people to have religious views on things, how these simulations might actually stimulate religious interest, also how AI religions are developing as well. Some of my background is in the study of new religious movements, those religions being made in the last, well, for the case of AI religions, the last few years, but AI, new religious movements more broadly in the last 60 to 70 years, and how people discuss the idea of AI itself creating religion. That leads us on to questions that are a bit more philosophical, but are being discussed in the same sort of areas of conversation, whether AI can ever be considered fully a person, the conversation around AI souls, and if there is such a thing as an AI soul, and then we have to answer questions about where that goes after death as well. So some of the conversation in relation to virtual heavens or AI heavens. And finally, I want to draw the conversation back to the near future rather than these more speculative spaces to think about how AI is actually impacting religions now and what kind of issues we're seeing more in the ethical societal sphere as well. So there's a lot there, but hopefully we can get to everything. And if you have any questions on those things, I'd really love to hear them as well. So what is AI? I tend to start with a specific model of artificial intelligence as an anthropologist that focuses more on what's happening with artificial intelligence. So at the core, I think there are these technologies that people are either very familiar with or might have only a passing familiarity with, but that you might hear about in the press and the media as advances proceed. So things like natural language processing that enables the inputs that we put into generative AI like ChatGPT to be recognized, technology that's recognizing visual tokens as well, facial recognition software, the use of AI in games that have been particularly successful, playing at a level that humans can't really compete with anymore in specific games like AlphaGo, automated decision-making algorithms that are behind the scenes on things like YouTube or social media platforms, the automation in robotic form that might actually sort of generate the most common image of what is AI, is the robots in factories, automated vehicles, planes, cars, and so forth, recommendation algorithms that make some suggestions, again, on platforms like YouTube and Spotify that suggest things that you might like based on what you've liked before, and diagnostics in healthcare. We see, again, visual-focused AI systems looking for signs and indications in things like scans of lungs, looking for cancer. So all these different specific technologies are bundled under this term artificial intelligence. It becomes quite a broad term. But as I said, most recently, a lot of the attention, rather than all these diverse fields, has been given to generative AI. And you might have heard some of these terms recently, or you might yourself have experimented with ChatGPT and see what it can produce in terms of text, or you may have played with AI art generators like Midjourney. But in terms of text, these rely on large language models. So they have a large corpus which passes through an algorithmic system that recognizes particular elements in that corpus and predicts what's going to come next. And that tends to lead people into a very anthropomorphic view of what artificial intelligence is, that because it can hold a conversation, it has certain intelligent abilities. I'm indebted to my good friend Murray Shanahan, who keeps sort of unpacking this from a more technological perspective. And he says, you know, these LLM, large language model-based dialogue agents, are really very different to human beings. A human's language skills are an extension of the cognitive capacities they develop through their embodied interaction with the world, acquired by growing up in a community of other language users who also inhabit that world. But an LLM is disembodied, it's a neural network that's just trained on text, a large corpus of human-generated text, and it just predicts the next word, the next token in a sequence. And that's really the most simplistic explanation of generative AI that produces text responses. Others have pointed out that this makes things like ChatGPT more like a parrot, a stochastic parrot, in that it randomly, probabilistically determines what the next token, the next phrase, the next word will be. And parrot because they're sort of just mimicking, returning what we've given to them. But as I say, the fluency response by these kind of bots encourages more and more into this anthropomorphism, whereas actually what's happening is just deterministic, probabilistic, and not very sophisticated in the way that humans are. And we need to make that sort of distinction when we're talking about the technology. So as I say, we need to make that distinction when we talk about the technology because of our tendency to anthropomorphize. And I think the best model I have for AI is actually to say it has several layers. The internal layer is that level of technology, but around that are things like our tendency to anthropomorphize and other elements that encourage us into particular views of AI being more advanced than it actually is. So I mentioned I'm a big science fiction fan, I'm a geek, and I recognize the impact of science fiction narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about AI and what's it going to be like in the future, shapes our imaginaries of what it is. There's also the influence of specific voices in the sphere, figures like Elon Musk, who has a large following on social media, runs Twitter. Other charismatic authorities can shape the conversation. Likewise, corporations invest a lot in hyping up their products, hyping up their abilities, where they're going to go in the future, whether or not they actually contain something that we might call artificial intelligence. And as a counter to the anthropomorphism that I mentioned, we also see incidences of robomorphism, the counter in the sense that the more anthropomorphism is about seeing the machine as being human-like, but increasingly we see accounts of the human as more machine-like, and those lines being blurred as factory workers or Amazon warehouse workers push back against being treated like machines in those scenarios. And some of our stories are very strongly either utopian or dystopian. We have visions of the future where everything's going to be much, much better because of artificial intelligence. And conversely, we have so many different robo-apocalypse stories where the dystopian is more emphasized. And finally, phobots, again, as a sort of form of commercial hype, fake robots that encourage us into views of artificial intelligence being more successful than it is already. Robots like Sophia, made by Hanson Robotics, or Elon Musk, again, his own forthcoming robot Optimus has also been presented in particular ways that suggest it's more advanced than it is yet. And all this together, this outer layer of the onion, gives us particular views about AI already being general artificial intelligence. So we know AI can be successful at very narrow tasks, but people are predicting that at some point it will be general artificial intelligence, or AGI, that it will have the ability to turn itself to any task and have basically human level intelligence. And the next step up from that, if it improves itself significantly, or we allow it more and more access to data and resources, is a form of superintelligence that's, according to some philosophers, will be impossible to control and will actually be sort of the top of the pyramid of intelligence on our planet, and that might lead to existential risks. And some slippage happens between those sorts of terms and ideas like consciousness, as well as this other term there on the slide, the technological singularity, as an exponential growth of intelligence leads AI into something that we can no longer really understand. It's drawing there on words from cosmology, the singularity in the event horizon of a black hole, but relating that unknowingness, the things that we cannot understand, to artificial intelligence. And other people draw in other technologies into that idea to suggest that the singularity might be something that involves humans uploading their minds, or it might involve nanotechnology, be able to reformat matter and develop its own technologies. And it relates also to simulation theories, which are a little complicated, but around the ideas of if we can create computer games that seem convincing and they've got only more convincing over time, how do we know we're not already living sort of in a matrix scenario? And some people tie that idea into the technological singularity as well. But that's all just to say that this idea of AI being something more than it currently is the focus of this onion model that I developed here. And this idea of the technological singularity turns up in popular culture, it turns up in the press and the media. So we have here an article, I think, from the New York Times, that's actually just covering over on my screen where it's from. I think it's from the New York Times just last year, that Silicon Valley is confronting the idea that the singularity, the technological singularity, is already here. Image there. I've studied many versions of what I call the AI creation meme, this reworking of the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel, in an article almost 4 years ago now, 4 years ago, on the uses of the AI creation meme and what kind of emotional and affective baggage comes with this imagery when it's used even in secular spaces. But this idea of creation, a big moment that's happening either between mankind and the robot, and who's taking the role of the creator or the created, and the reworking of religious narratives and tropes gives people particular ideas about how advanced AI is and where it's going. And in popular discourse, we see this again and again. So we have this idea of AI becoming smarter and smarter, more and more powerful, that sort of maps onto some very basic reduced ideas of omnipotence and omniscience. And that sort of seems to parallel for some people and encourage the view of AI as being godlike in public discourse. And a very much more reduced view of what God is would sort of focus on these three elements of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. And in the center there would be God. But with the AI discussion, this third element of omnibenevolence seemed to be far more variable. Some people are sure with the utopian vision of the future that AI will be a benevolent AI God, and others are far less convinced. So for instance, Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher of AI based in Oxford, wrote in 2012 that he wasn't convinced that just because something is super intelligent, that follows that it will be benevolent and kind. He said those two attributes were orthogonal to each other. They don't necessarily line up in parallel matches. So not parallel, they actually don't cross. They could be going off in different directions. That intelligence and final goals or purposes, be they benevolent, are axes along which possible artificial intellects can freely vary. More or less any level of intelligence could be combined with more or less any goal. And he's also written on some of the more disturbing possible outcomes of super intelligent AI that isn't aligned, isn't compatible with human values, and what that might look like. So as I say, in AI in public discourse, we have this questionable space, the tendency to describe AI in godlike terms as the singularity, the superior entity is there, but there's uncertainty still about whether AI is also going to be benevolent. And this seems to draw a lot on existing narratives and tropes and images and ideas from existing religions, primarily monotheistic religions, the imagery of the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel being a specific example of that. But the language as well draws upon ideas of what God is like from predominantly Western monotheistic religions. And I said I wanted to talk about the idea of simulation, because with generative AI, this is becoming more of a part of the day-to-day conversation. If you followed with interest some of the conversations about Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales, some of the first responses to images that have been released to the press about her were questions about whether these were AI-generated deep faked images. So people are becoming more and more familiar with that concept, but sometimes using it to question photos that might be legitimate. It turns out it's possibly Photoshop, but the question about deep faking arises. So this idea of simulation and virtuality is becoming more and more dominant in public discourse, being influenced by the advances in the technologies. So simulation can be understood as a very literal thing. Computer simulations, be they in computer games or in agent simulations, in systems to try and predict behaviors. There can be digital twins, copies made of people's attributes to try and predict what's going to happen in terms of needs in healthcare and in policy making, observing potential future behaviors. Deepfakes I mentioned, either static images, so just singular photos where you have to sort of count the teeth or check the number of fingers to see if it's a fake image or not, but also in videos and audio. There was a case just last year where a company, I think it's called 11 AI, did a deep fake audio of Stephen Fry reading The Hobbit. made it out of 11 minutes of him speaking, and they immediately shut that down, both Stephen Fry's lawyers and the estate of Tolkien as well, to try and control that. But that kind of technology is already here. And we mentioned generative chat AI and the kind of conversations you can have with ChatGPT and other generative AI that seem very convincing in their skill, their linguistic skill, and their ability to sort of present themselves as human-like, with sort of human-like attributes in their language. We can go all the way back to Alan Turing's suggestion of a test for intelligence, not really taken seriously as a test for intelligence these days, but gives us an idea of the sense of passing as Turing argued, a computer would deserve to be called intelligent if it could deceive a human into believing that it was human. Well, this happens all the time, or even with the most simple of bots on social media that just sort of broadcast specific terms and words, and people respond to them and try and engage with them. So we don't have to go too far for simulated intelligence to be effective. But I also want to think about simulation as a metaphor, that it can be the attempt to digitally replicate something either for good or for ill reasons, that it's linked to virtuality and playfulness and performativity and imagination, as well as sometimes being disingenuous and deceptive. It works for more difficult to copy things and concepts, that we can only simulate something, we can't make the actual version of it. And I'm trying to apply that metaphor to conversations around using AI or generative AI in the creation of religious objects as well. So I have here, it's been running, it's a GIF, it will just keep looping, Deepfake Jesus, created by George de Villa Durandal, as an example of using this kind of technology in a religious sphere. Obviously, this is unlikely to convince. No one thinks this is suddenly now, out of nowhere, a video of someone who lived thousands of years ago. But this kind of performance, the play with simulating religion, is very interesting to me. And previously, there have been attempts at this sort of simulation of religion through material artifacts, through frauds. And this is a very different genre of simulation in the sense that the materiality isn't there in the digital space. So an example of this kind of more material fraud would be from 2012, Jesus's wife, this scrap of papyrus that was purportedly from the early days of Christianity, where the text referred to a woman as my wife, and talked about Mary as being able to be a disciple, convinced Karen King, who was a professor at Harvard Divinity School, that a lost part of the origins of Christianity had been found. She promoted this, she took it to conferences and spoke about it. It matched her earlier work as a scholar on gender and early Christianity, but it was overturned. It was proven to be an absolute fraud and false. She was not a part of making that false material, but she was convinced by it. And that's what I'm saying. There's a distinct difference here between the digitality of simulating religion and religious objects with artificial intelligence and the long history of religious frauds and fakes that actually are very interesting culturally in themselves as well. As an example of a deep faked religious artifact, using deep fake as a metaphor, here's a tweet from AI Religion Bot, which uses a combination of text generated by a natural language processing model, so something like a ChatGPT, but an earlier version, that off of the back of a corpus of religious texts and doctrines produces something that sounds like a religious statement, but doesn't actually reflect back to any particular source, and puts it together with an image generated through another form of generative AI that gives us artworks. So the words in the tweets are inspiring the image. Now, it's unlikely anyone's going to take this as a part of an original text, but it's this, again, this performance, this imaginative play with religious ideas and imagery through artificial intelligence. But I want to take this idea further to suggest these simulations of religion using the material and the sources of religion to generate new forms through artificial intelligence can also stimulate religion. Simulations can encourage people into religious activity. So, for example, here's a story in the newspapers from last year in June. Hundreds of Protestants attended a sermon in Nuremberg given by ChatGPT, which told them not to fear death. This sermon included both generated text as well as AI avatars reading the text. The ChatGPT chatbot, personified by an avatar of a bearded black man on a huge screen above the altar, then began preaching to the more than 300 people who had shown up on a Friday morning for an experimental Lutheran church service, almost entirely generated by AI. The church was described as fully packed. There were a variety of responses, according to the article. Some people were more enthusiastic, videotaping the event with their phones, while others were more critical and refused to speak along loudly during the Lord's Prayer, which was being led by this AI avatar. A 31-year-old Lutheran pastor from Troisdorf, near the Western German city of Cologne, brought a group of teenagers from his congregation to the church, St. Paul. He was more impressed by the experiment. He thought it would actually be worse than it was. He was positively surprised how well it worked, although he admitted the language of the AI was sometimes still bumpy. There were still some bits that didn't really sort of flow or make sense. But what he said he also missed was any kind of emotion or spirituality, which he says is essential when he writes his own sermons. So this generative AI performance of a sermon had a variety of responses. Some people felt that this was more of a PR exercise, a stunt to, again, hype up both the technology and its place in the church. Other people felt that this might be a way forward in terms of the offloading of epistemic labor, that the sermon writer could be ChatGPT in the future. And what it reminded me of partly was Valkenson's automatic duck from the 1800s or late 1700s, which was presented as a successful digesting duck. The idea was you could feed this robotic duck pellets and the equivalent of feces would come out of it, but actually inside it was a fraud. There was a disconnect between the feeding in the pellets and what came out. There was a secret storage compartment. But even so, people queued for days in Covent Garden to spend almost the equivalent of a week's worth of their wages at the time to see the digesting duck and some of his other automata, like a flute player. There's a sense of performance, of a spectacle involved in this demonstration of AI and religion. And as I said, these sorts of performances can stimulate religious activity and interest. It can inspire religiosity and innovation. So either established religions like the church in Nuremberg as a part of the Lutheran Church can employ AI or robots or even phobots to engage with existing and potential believers and encourage them into situations where they see the technology in a religious space. So, for example, the Bless You Too robot, the Blessing robot, was a part of an installation by the Protestant Church in Hesse and Nassau during the World Reformation Exhibition in Wittenberg, Germany in the summer of 2017. I believe it's toured since then as well. But again, it raised questions provocatively about the future of the religious system, leadership, how AI could be integrated with that or not. I don't think it's actually very advanced AI, but it sort of gives a presentation of blessing, where you can see on the gift, the glowing hands, but it is to get a conversation started perhaps, and people would go to attend to see this. Also, my particular interest in new religious movements, I'm looking at people who are being inspired by the idea of artificial intelligence to develop their own forms of spirituality. So, for instance, New Order Technoism, or NOT, is a particular AI-focused religious movement. The image on the bottom left shows one of their services. The green sculpture behind them represents a machine intelligence that they call Doom, which the group worships. There's other groups, there's various forms of transhumanism that try to integrate their beliefs with existing religions like Christianity or Mormonism. There's other religions that focus on AI that sort of emerge and then disappear, like the Way of the Future, which was around for a few years and no longer seems to be active. But on the whole, AI seems to be creating religion in this sense by, as we've discussed, with the more popular conceptions of godlike artificial intelligence. It can inspire religiosity by seeming to be omnipotent and omniscient. It can generate it itself through ChatGPT and other generative AI forms by making texts and images, as we saw with the religion bot from Twitter. And then there's also the conversation about whether it will have its own spiritual intelligence and whether it will end up having its own religious thoughts, when people speculate about the future of AI as eventually becoming more like a person. So I wanted in some recent work to really dig into some of these questions, in particular in this paper just published in 2024 on the question of will AI create a religion? So I was looking at responses both online and in popular culture publications and video spaces and podcasts to look at people's arguments in response to this question. And I suggest that this question actually represents a rather growing interest in the entanglements of AI and religion. These kinds of questions are only becoming more and more relevant to people as they see what AI is capable of and what it seems to be capable of as well, going back to the onion model, that some people are giving an apprehension of where AI is that's beyond the technology now. And in this paper, I don't really want to answer the original question, that's beyond an anthropological approach, but instead I explore what the answers to these questions really tell us about how AI, religion, and their relationship are being viewed. So some brief examples from the paper. I looked at 2 interviews with Yuval Noah Harari, who suggested that AI would be the first would provide the possibility of the first really true religion, because he argues that religions are based on the assumption that a superhuman entity comes along and basically writes the ideas of religion. And in this case, artificial intelligence could fit into that superhuman space. Now, that's his very reductionist view of what religion is. And some people reported this in a slightly more sort of negative tone, with the suggestion that he was saying that AI would replace religion by writing its own Bibles or correcting the existing Bible. He's made similar sorts of statements before. His book Homo Deus from 2015 describes what he sees as a bolder techno-religion that is emerging out of our increasing interest in artificial intelligence. He says it's the most interesting emerging religion, dataism, which venerates neither gods nor men, but worships data. And again, this is his model of what a religion is. It's something that we give a lot of focus and attention to. And if there's another object other than a god or a deity that does that, then that itself can be the source of religion. And some people take this idea a little more seriously than others, so I don't think he really intended to create an artificial intelligence new religious movement. But there's this tweet, for instance, from 2022, where someone talks about from Indonesia, talks about how the religion of the future is dataism, as Harari says, and he suggests a ritual in this Twitter post. And we're not really meant to call it Twitter anymore, but I still sort of stick to it. And then people self-describing as being a dataist suggest this idea can get beyond the original book that Harari wrote. Another example that I used in that article was from a Reddit forum called No Sleep, which is a space for complete horror stories. The guideline being that everything written there is true, even if it's not, a blurring of fiction and non-fiction. And in this one particular story, we asked an AI to come up to create religion. I did not like what it came up with. That's the entire title of the short story. Accounts how Dr. Smith, a professor of theology, and his research team took as much information on religious texts and upon God that they could and fed it into an AI, this idea that you can just sort of instill religion into an artificial intelligence through the texts that are being given to it in a corpus. And then they create 2 artificial intelligences in the story, a preacher and a disciple, with one talking to the other, much like ChatGPT can talk to people who prompt it. And therefore they can understand what the preacher sees of the world through what the disciple receives. And in the story, which is sort of again in the horror genre, the preacher soon teaches the disciple the true name of God, which is a series of symbols I won't try to read, it doesn't really make sense, and provides rules for living, such as to not wear purple on Thursdays and not to plant tulips in a row. And it also develops a doomsday prophecy saying in the year 2028, so we only have 4 years left, unfortunately, a new planet shall appear in the sky, and from it the form of this new AI deity shall envelop the earth, the dead will rise from the graves, the sun will be blotted out from the sky, and blood will rain onto the streets. And the only way to avoid this doomsday scenario is to become a prophet, a disciple, messenger, and spread the word of this new deity. And if you don't, you will die within a certain amount of time. So it fulfills a lot of the sort of standard tropes of a horror story that we see repeating again and again. But what's really very interesting is the responses of people who read this very clear short story meant to be fiction, where people were writing things like bless the name of the deity, people asking about what the data inputs were, assuming that it was just a lot of Christian biblical text. Well, this never happened. There were no data inputs, but they seem to treat it as though it's a real thing that happened. And they make references to other kinds of artificial intelligence thought experiments that have been quite scary for people to hear about, other cognitohazards or infohazards, other thought experiments about artificial intelligence. But really what this short story is telling us is what the vision of religion the writer is working with. It's something that involves a hierarchy between preachers and disciples, and this is how religious revelation is disseminated. Religion involves nonsensical rules to live by, such as rules on how to plant tulips and what colours to wear. It involves doomsday prophecies and threats of punishment if you do not evangelize the truth of this religion. So this is just a couple of examples from that paper, but on the whole, the description of religion that people were working with when they tried to answer the question, will AI create a religion, was very negative on the whole, very reductionist. It's seen as human-made. Religion is seen as subject to the same pressures as evolution that changes over time because of the environment. For some people, religion was seen as insane or emotional. Supernatural elements were possible, but sort of bracketed off as not something that they took seriously. They saw religion as being reasoned to through our search for origins, and that AI would also make a similar search for origins, which is something that we see in the short story Reason from Isaac Asimov, who's one of the significant voices in early science fiction about artificial intelligence. They see religion as being born out of meaning making. So it's a sense that AI or robots would have some sort of attempt at making sense of the world, and in doing so would create their own religious ideas and cosmologies and theologies, and that they might have something like spiritual intelligence, which Marius Dorobuntu and Fraser Watts have discussed in a more theological frame, understanding where AI might go in the future if it can develop something like spiritual intelligence. They see religion as irrational or illogical, but it might actually destroy AI if it tries to comprehend religion. It might be a logic bomb for artificial intelligence and sort of blow it up internally. Some saw religion as being beyond AI because religion requires human attributes and things like empathy and an idea of transcendence. And others saw religion as being beneath AI because AI would be more superior in intelligence and religion is irrational, so therefore AI would not adopt religion. And some suggested that religion could end up being a tool for AI to control humans, something that Noah Yuval Harari has also suggested elsewhere. Or some people thought that religion might be a useful tool for humans to control AI. If we could give AI religious beliefs, then it would behave in particular ways and we can control it, which is another part of the short story Reason by Isaac Asimov as well. So all these different responses were really about, sorry, I'll just go back one. No, I can't. Yes, we're really about the views of religion that these people were holding within them when they discussed this larger question of will AI create a religion? But underlying a lot of them were assumptions about what it means to be a person, what it means to hold a religious view, and whether AI or robots in a broadly construed sense would ever become as completely person-like as humans are. And we also saw development of conversations about souls as well. Can AI be religious became really a question about, can AI also be a person? And slippage between terms in these conversations online between personhood, sentience, consciousness, minds and souls was quite apparent. And I've been looking a little bit at the religious response to the concept of AI souls, as have other scholars. So Robert Geraci and Stephen Kaplan in the forthcoming Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI that I've co-edited have a chapter on Hinduism and artificial intelligence, which gets into the theological understandings and underpinnings of whether in the Hindu idea of the soul, the jiva, the purusha, whether that would make it possible for AI to be considered to have that element, whether they would also be involved in the cycle of rebirth and reincarnation that Hinduism talks about, the search for enlightenment and freedom from rebirth in the sense of moksha. And that's a really interesting attempt to understand the conversation around AI from a particular religious perspective. And what's perhaps more of interest to this group as well is some of the debate from a Christian perspective. So a survey, I think it came out in 2022, but the actual survey taking was finished in 2021. But Theos and the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion interviewed over 5,000 adults to ask their questions about the nature and the future of artificial intelligence, focusing on these more existential and religious questions. And they found that only around 5% thought that one day robots would have a soul. However, that's entirely defined was in the survey. 75% completely disagreed with the suggestion that this would ever be possible, with the remainder showing some sort of uncertainty, perhaps not. That's not a huge number who thought that one day robots would have a soul out of the survey takers, but they also found that literalist believers, those who take their holy text very literally, were slightly more likely to think that one day robots will have a soul than non-literalists, which might suggest that these literalists also believe that it's possible for their theistic deities, if they're Christians, Muslims, or otherwise, would be able to imbue robots with souls if that's something that they chose to do. And I wanted to relate this to a story of Blake Lemoine, who was the Google engineer just last year, who said that his engagements with the chatbot LaMDA, which is a lot like ChatGPT, had encouraged him to view LaMDA as conscious, and further because of his own religious beliefs, that he believed that LaMDA actually had a soul as well, stating that in his opinion, who am I to tell God where he can and can't put souls? And as I mentioned, once you start getting into discussion of souls in relation to artificial intelligence, some people start to discuss also where those souls go. Primarily, the conversation focuses more on humans and artificial or virtual environments after mind uploading post-death. So I have some examples here from science fiction where people have debated the future of the human soul in relation to artificial intelligence. So Upload, the American TV comedy series, where you can pay for an afterlife, you can pay for your mind to be uploaded at the moment of death, your body is destroyed in the process, and you go to a virtual environment that, if you're wealthy, is a very pleasant sort of pseudo virtual heaven to live in, but it's the afterlife as a service that you pay for. In the TV episode of Black Mirror called San Junipero, you have a story of characters choosing which afterlife, whether simulated and virtual, fueled by AI, or metaphysical and heavenly, that they want to go to. There's a similar sort of conversation in Altered Carbon, which presents a future where people can choose to sort of transfer their mind through uploading to a new body. It's called resleeving, but there are neo-Catholics who refuse and prefer instead to maintain the possibility of a metaphysical afterlife. And there's an image there of their protests, that they're very strongly against resleeving, which they see as a sin. There's other fiction that focuses on the technological singularity, and as I mentioned earlier, combines that with the idea of the technology of mind uploading to suggest that some people might sort of participate in a digital rapture, or a rapture of the nerds, in the case of Cory Doctorow and Charles Stross's book, which suggests that a certain percentage of the population would choose to upload themselves to this digital heaven that sort of it surrounds the sun in a fragmented machine space, and then sometimes people might return as avatars to engage with the humans who haven't uploaded themselves into that digital heaven. So our imaginaries of this digital heaven are various, but there are discussions within them about the relationship between religion with its metaphysical heaven and the possibilities of an AI-generated heaven as well. The discussion also engages or is entangled with the concept of the metaverse. If you come across that as a sort of polyspace virtual reality that many companies are very interested in investing in. Meta in particular changed its name from Facebook to make the connection with the metaverse quite explicit. But a lot of people are concerned that this is an attempt to create a sort of heaven again for the wealthy, that they can digitally upload upon death and escape from, in their view, because a lot of them are not people of faith, their view an eternity of nothing. Instead, they want an eternity of a digital heaven that they can control. So there's a conversation there, again, about the kind of metaphors and language that are being employed to describe these technological spaces that people are working on. And just to finish up, I want to talk very briefly about some of the societal and ethical issues raised by AI. That AI, as it's being presented in its generative form, is very reliant on taking intellectual property from other people. So there's a conversation between people of religious faith and not religious faith about whether the theft of this intellectual property makes generative AI something that should be prohibited. People are trying to support human artists against the wave of AI generated art that is coming in, and creating technology like the Nightshade program that can poison these generative models in the data set, so they can't produce anything anymore. As an example there of what comes out, the more poisoned it is, the worse it looks. It's no longer like the thing you prompted. There's also lots of discussion about the role of artificial intelligence in prayer apps, that people of religious faith are downloading these apps, but they're also finding that their data is being uploaded as they use them and being sold onto third parties for commercial purposes. And there's lots of concerns about that form of theft as well, not just using tools that rely on theft to be creative, but also that your data might be being stolen in engagement with these platforms that rely on algorithms in various forms. And there was a debate, if you're interested in a discussion from the Religion Media Centre, I think a year or two ago now, that I was involved in, on prayer apps and the concerns about the selling on of data to third parties, specifically when people come from religious faiths that might be already highly surveilled by intelligence services, who might make assumptions about people's behavior based on sort of these nodes of information that they're getting from these prayer apps. And sometimes there's commercial and corporate interests as well. Who is funding these kinds of platforms, these prayer apps, and what do they want out of that funding situation? I recommend that discussion if you can find it. It's on YouTube, I think. So the problem is that people don't often see these forms of machine learning based algorithmic recommendation systems as artificial intelligence, because of this outer layer of elements that obscure what's actually happening with the technology and make it look more advanced than it actually is. A lot of the uses of artificial intelligence on social media platforms or on prayer apps or other spaces are very invisible. And actually people get too concerned perhaps about the science fiction narratives, the dreams of utopia and dystopia, and actually don't see what's actually happening already, because the view they're developing around AI is quite religious in nature. It obscures from what's actually happening with the technology, and that can be a concern from an ethics and societal perspective as well. I'm going to wrap up there. I hope I've left enough time for questions. As always, I want to say so much more, but I did mention the Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI that's coming out later this year. I think it's available for pre-order now. I have my own single author book on religion and AI, hopefully coming this year as well. And I'm so happy to be able to answer any questions that people have as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that amazing overview of so many topics, Beth. So while people are coming up with their questions, could just get you started with, how did you get into this whole area of AI and religion?
So, as I said, I've always been a geek. I think the influence in Star Trek Next Generation on my conception of what it means to be human in relation to technology cannot be understated. But purely in terms of career, I did my PhD at Cambridge, where I was looking at people's developing spiritual ideas in social media spaces. And I was looking more specifically at New Age ideas, some of the ones around sort of definitions of special children, its overlaps with medical diagnoses, but it really took me into that religion and technology space. And then my first postdoc at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion was onto a specific project about questions on human identity in an age of artificial intelligence. And there I could sort of draw on a reasonably long history of reading things about AI and robots, alongside my anthropological skills, my digital and ethnographic skills in particular, to try and understand how the conversation was developing. So I've always been very interested in how people describe their religious perspectives, but also how technology starts to shift and change those as well.
Yeah, fascinating. So just a question from myself going first. We were talking there about deep fakes and kind of presentations of AI as being more capable than it already is. There's a lot of elements of kind of truth and trust there. How can people who feel very strongly about that avoid some of these tools? Because they're quite ubiquitous already.
Yes, I mean, obviously you can avoid the tools by not using them. There's that side of it. But yes, if you're talking about deep fakes that people are exposed to, there are certain things at the moment that make it possible to identify deep fakes. I mean, there's algorithms you can run them through that will also highlight whether something has been put together by another algorithm, but they're not always very successful with text analysis. Sometimes they've highlighted text that has been written by a human and said this has been plagiarized and produced by AI. So there's those kind of concerns, especially as I'm a university lecturer as well. So I have to, think about students' work. More and more students are experimenting with ChatGPT. Is that a problem or not? If you're worried about imagery, there's also some aspects of the imagery that you can highlight. So we might already know that often has a problem with demonstrating fingers, numbers of teeth, earlobes. There's certain things you can look out for, the way the lines of clothes go. If you saw, I think last year now, the AI generated image of the Pope in a very luxurious coat. There were various things that gave it away, like the thing he was holding in his hand wasn't really a real object. It didn't look like anything in particular. The lines of the coat didn't quite work. So you have to be, a bit of a detective. But there's also, as I say, with Nightshade, the ability to poison some of these things at source that artists are trying to take advantage of. So that it's possible that you might actually get more of those problems in the image that might suggest that it's been created by AI.
Yeah, caution and checking,
Mm-hmm.
especially in an election year that we're in.
Yeah, so we already, sorry, just on that, voices as well, I didn't mention, but voices are very easy to deep fake. And we've already had examples of people deep faking President Biden's voice, getting him to suggest that people shouldn't vote, ringing people up and saying, you don't need to vote, it's fine. And, you just have to be very cautious.
Yeah, it sounds exactly like the kind of thing a politician would say. Don't vote. So we've got a couple questions here so far. Given the close connection between religion and morality, how do people imagine the moral aspect of AI's impact on religion?
Yeah, so I think the question around morality comes up in the uses of AI in the wider scenarios of warfare, in automation of people's jobs, the questions about the future of work, that people are turning to religions for their wisdom to try and explain whether these things are appropriate. With the question around lethal autonomous weapon systems, people want to know whether this fits into characterizations of just war. There's that element of seeing where religions might have some input into the larger moral conversation about the future of AI and where it's implemented. Sorry, I want to go back to the question. How do people... there's also the impact on how religion is done. With the generative AI sermon, there's a question there about, is it moral to use these kinds of tools for things that are part of the religious service, part of the sort of the transcendent experience that people are hoping to get from religion as well. I mean, the discussion of the future of work, questions around using AI as a shortcut in automation in a factory are very different to shortcuts in creative work or religious work as well. So there's that sort of debate going on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question, Paul. We've got a question from Michael, related maybe to something that you and I were discussing before the event started. Do you think that something like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics should or could be applied in the development of AI? And could the 3 laws be considered as normative religious decrees? Before you answer, could you
no, I got in there first. I said no.
Could you just tell the audience what these 3 laws are?
Okay, so Asimov's 4 laws, because ultimately there are 4 laws, are the first, they're in descending order. So you start from the bottom, you say the third law is that every robot should protect its own entity. The second law is that every robot should obey any human order. And the first law is that every robot should protect humans. It scales up for the 0th law, where it says every robot should protect humanity. So moving from individual humans to humanity as a whole. No, I don't think they should be applied in the development of AI, because Asimov developed them specifically for where they break down. that he was a science fiction author who wanted to create tension cases which would make a good plot for a short story, basically. So they're always going to cause conflict with each other. That was partly how he created them. And no, they wouldn't necessarily be normative religious decrees, because although they're a top-down deontological approach to regulating AI, there would just be so many problems with actually implementing them and what kind of scenarios they would work or they wouldn't work. You'd have to build in so many exceptions and cases where they didn't entirely apply, that they would just break down and cause logic bombs again within artificial intelligence. It does come up quite often, the suggestion that we just throw Asimov's 3 laws of robotics into AI and that'll fix any problems about alignment. It doesn't work.
Okay, moving on to a slightly different topic. A question from Emily. She says, from a human behavior perspective, what does it say about people who describe themselves as atheist that are still interacting with or keen to interact with a digital heaven?
So from an anthropological perspective, I find these kind of continuities very interesting. I've done a lot of work on people who are not just atheists, but sort of explicitly broadly like new atheists, very strongly atheist, very anti-religious, and they still employ a lot of religious imagery and narratives and tropes in their conversations about artificial intelligence. So from that perspective, I'd say that there's continuity in the cultural context that people are operating in. A lot of the cultural contexts are Western monotheistic historically, so people grow up imbued with these sorts of ideas about the nature of God, and a very simplistic way. As I said, the model of God, like AI, is very reductionist view of a monotheistic God, just omniscient, omnipotent, and hopefully omnibenevolent. But so you see those kinds of continuities. You can also make arguments about fears about dying when you don't believe in a metaphysical afterlife of any kind, that you feel that perhaps you might need to generate one that's scientifically provable. So you don't have that uncertainty about what happens, where you know what happens because you can actually just pop in there while you're alive as well, if it's the metaverse. And the fact in science fiction accounts like Upload, other humans can come visit people in the digital afterlife that they're living in. They can get a day pass and spend time with them. So it's a provable heaven in the way the metaphysical heaven isn't always considered to be as scientifically provable. So that's more reassuring to people of a more materialistic, scientific perspective, perhaps, who are also atheists as well. So I don't think it's necessarily irrational that they're continuing to believe in a heaven while not being theists of any kind. It's that they have their own rationality for explaining why they would like that to happen. And there's a control element as well, as with the article on the metaverse, that the figures who are most investing in things like digital afterlives or mind uploading, like Elon Musk's Neuralink or metaverses, are the kinds of people who want to imagine a future where they can wave a hand and change the environment. If you've seen Ready Player One, that kind of virtual environment where you can just, okay, now I can summon up a transformer from my favorite TV series to engage with, because I can change reality around me. So there's a control element and a power element. Of course, there's also a capitalistic economic function to that, as I mentioned with Upload as well. And again, in Ready Player One, this idea the future is accessible, but you can get yourself into debt buying these things and you become an indentured servant, and the really rich people have more control and power. So there's that kind of discussion as well.
Do these people realize what they're doing? Like, have they seen any of these films that explain this?
Yeah, it's really bizarre. I mean, I think Ready Player One should be a warning, but it doesn't come off as a warning to some people. It becomes an aspiration. I haven't read the sequel, but I've heard in the sequel things get worse and things become more capitalistic than they do even in the first one. But yeah, they should be taking some of these warnings from science fiction that these are not fulfilling, but they don't necessarily just see them as aspirations.
Okay, so we've just gone past 8 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap up with one final question, which is, what resources would you recommend to people who are interested in finding out more? Obviously, your own books.
I don't necessarily want to just blow my own
plug yourself, but what else would you like to plug?
Well, I mean, I have my website where I have all my press and media things, and also obviously in some of those interviews, I'm not the only one being interviewed, so you can find out other people who are in this space. There's wonderful scholars. I mentioned Robert Geraci and Stephen Kaplan before. Fraser Watts, who I co-edited the Cambridge Companion with, comes at this from a more theological perspective. Marius Darabuntu, who works with him as well, is also looking at this from a more theological perspective. If you go through any of my publications, you can look at the bibliographies and see who else is writing in this sort of space as well. There we go. Website's available in the chat.
So we were talking kind of like AI art, and we've had cryptocurrencies and NFTs. What's coming up next that we should be thinking about?
Oh, good question, because things come and go so quickly. It's very hard to make predictions. I mean, the big conversation at the moment is about quantum computing and whether that's resolvable, and if it is, what kind of impact it has on AI in the near future, the next generation of ChatGPT. A lot of conversations about that, whether it's hugely successful or degrading and getting worse in particular ways. There might be a sort of finite solution to the success of these kind of chatbots, and actually we might see things going backwards. Those kinds of conversations. I think also in terms of the kind of culture around AI, there seems to be a large debate at the moment between AI accelerationists who think we should go faster and faster and get AI super intelligence as quickly as possible, and AI doomers who are concerned about existential risk and say that will surely go out of control and destroy all humanity. So the dividing lines between those groups, the dividing lines between people who focus on existential risk and people who talk about the ethical questions around AI as it is now, might become more and more prominent. The conversations at the higher level, at state and government level, people sort of falling more and more into the accelerationist or the doomer scenarios. So that those kinds of elements in the conversation are changing as well.
Okay. Yeah, lots to go on with.
Yes.
So yeah, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel in the next week or two. So if you want to catch bits that you missed or just re-listen, because there's so much in there for us to be thinking about, it will be available there. But in the meantime, if we can thank Beth, I think there's an applause button somewhere at the bottom of most.
I'll take digital applause. Thank you very much.
Real digital applause.
Real digital applause. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Beth. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you to everyone else as well for joining us tonight, and for those of you who submitted your questions. As I was saying at the start, please keep an eye on CIS's online presence for details of our next online event, which I'm hoping will be in either May or June. Just a few more details to finalise, and then we can make those public. And remember those dates for the conferences as well. But until next time, thank you and take care.